Hello and welcome to the One Way to Do It podcast, presented by Genius Move Audio Academy. My name is Paul Brewer, and in this podcast I chat to audio professionals about their skills. Please visit geniusmove.ie for more details on the Academy. Today's guest is music professional Roger Bechirian, who has worked as a recording engineer, producer and general studio brain, particularly with Eden Studio in London. More recently, he's also been Irish band Bell-X1's manager/producer. I recently spoke to him on a slightly crackly iPhone line from London. When I started this podcast, the last thing I wanted to do was have two old codgers chatting about the good old days.
A little less of the codgers.
But indeed. But at the same time, how can we skip that in terms of, your background? It's fascinating. I don't know if you remember, but I mentioned the record that really made major impact on me was Going Underground, which you were involved in.
Well, yeah, as memory serves, it's such a long time ago now.
And also, another track I want to sort of perhaps discuss was Tempted by Squeeze, which is Bob Clearmountain's favourite mix, as far as I recall.
I know. And I spoke to Bob, actually, and I quizzed him on that, and he was quite astonishingly humble, actually. I was really surprised. I mean, he said that it's something that he wished he could have done. And the irony of all of this is that I remember driving my car to the studio, to Eden Studios. I was somewhere in Hammersmith in the traffic jam, and that song that Bryan Adams did, Everything I Do for You, came on the radio. It at number one. I immediately knew it was a Clear Mountain mix. I could hear straight away. I mean, he has a certain way with reverbs, which I've never been able to fathom. And, he was kind of a hero as well, in a way. I mean, he had this fantastic ear, I think, still does, I suppose. It was a comment from a god, as far as I was concerned. I was very flattered.
Yeah, indeed. The Jam record, was that just another record you did, or was it a major event in your life, or how did you see it at the time?
Well, no, it wasn't. At the time, none of it was a major event. I did a couple of things with them, and they just booked the studio.
And this was Eden Studios, yeah?
Yes, this is Eden. And what I realized later was that they were basically doing a test with me, which I hadn't even considered. I thought they just, I was the engineer available for the session. They'd asked whether I could do the session, which was okay, fair enough. And they were weird. They were very quiet about everything. They weren't very forthcoming, but they were easy to work with, and they were very professional. Their gear turned up in a truck, and they had all these roadies organizing and setting up for them, and it was a very professional setup. And they were great. They were fine to work with. But later on, I was approached, or rather, my manager was approached. They wanted me to produce their next album or work with them on their next album. And he turned it down. I'm not sure why, but anyway, that got turned down. And later on, I think the follow-up album, which was a year or so later, they asked again, and again he turned me down. In retrospect, I would have killed him if I'd known at the time, but that certainly I would have loved to work with them. But I think it was more to do with politics with him, and because I was in the same stable as Costello and Nick Lowe and everything. I think it had a lot to do with that. But yeah, so basically it was a test. So I did the recordings with them, and then the tapes went, and that was it. I never heard anything again until, I heard the finished record on radio and on their albums.
Wow!
But it was good. It was nice working with them. I enjoyed it.
And you were the engineer, and who produced it then?
They worked on their own. It was just them and me. We did the basic tracks, and I think there was, as far as I remember, there was a couple of guitar parts and things. I think Paul threw down a rough vocal. That was it. There wasn't any. I didn't really get involved with the fleshing out of the tracks. There were 2 songs we did, and I can't remember what they were now. The other one was, and yeah, that was it. And they took the tapes away, and as I said, then I think what they decided was they approached me to make work on the album at that point, but that didn't happen. So I think they worked with, who was the guy who did most of the stuff for them? I've forgotten his name now. He was South African, I think. He must have...
Coppersmith.
That's it, Coppersmith Haven.
Yes.
I think he must have finished the albums with them.
And did you mix it?
No, I didn't mix it. I simply recorded it. I did nothing else. I recorded the basic tracks.
Right, okay.
I can't take credit for that. I would love to have done that too. But,
yeah. So it was just another band. You know, another good band, but, another band at the time.
Yeah, it was a good band. I looked forward to meeting them. I was intrigued to find out how they worked, what they were like as people. And it was all very matter of fact. I mean, I assumed somebody was going to come in to produce the record. I assumed it was going to go on. But they'd taken, I think they took 3 days, 3 or 4 days. It was really short. I remember moving the kit around a bit. I wasn't very happy about the kit. And what was it? I've forgotten the drummer's name, actually.
Rick Buckler.
That's it. He wasn't very happy about me doing that. Apparently they had this thing where they'd set up and that was it. But I didn't like the way it sounded. So I remember moving his kit. And they seemed really pleased with the results. They weren't kind of animated in any way about their feelings. So it was like, well, yeah, I guess this is going well. See you tomorrow, guys. And that was it. And as I said, then the tapes disappeared. And then the rest is history. It was obviously Coppersmith Haven finished everything off, and that was it. It was a shame. It was a shame I didn't get to do any more with them, because I would have liked that very much.
So can you tell me about the time? This was obviously peak recording time and stuff. Like, were you working 7 days a week, 12 hours a day, whatever it was? Right, okay.
Pretty much, yeah. I mean, I think...
and you were obviously young.
Yes.
Indeed.
Oh, those days are long gone.
Yes.
No, I mean, I was literally going from one album pretty much to another. There was loads of stuff to be doing. And because I was part of the Riviera Global Group under management, I was working with Nick, and then we'd do something with Costello. Then I was working with Dave Edmunds, and I was working with Rockpile. Then I was doing something with Carlene. So it was just this constant flow of stuff. And in between it, people would, I'd be contacted to work with somebody else on a different project. I mean, the Undertones obviously took up quite a bit of time as well. So there was all of that going on. Yeah, and there was a steady flow of people coming through the studio, just working on. I mean, Mark Bolan didn't live very far away. I used to do demos with him.
Wow.
There were, endless amounts of people that came into the studio. Some, pretty big names who used to live in that area, kind of Richmond, Kingston, the wealthier parts of West London.
This was all with Eden Studios, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was all at Eden. And it was in Chiswick.
Oh, right, okay. And Eden was your employer, is that correct?
Eden was my employer. I started with them when they had a 4-track studio in Kingston. I was desperately trying to get into studios, and I'd approached Abbey Road because it was the only one that I knew from reading the Beatles albums and things. And I also approached Morgan Studios in the early days because I know Eddie Offord had worked there, and Vision Studios, a whole bunch of them. And I was turned down by everybody. And then I tried R.G. Jones, were looking for somebody in Wimbledon. That didn't really work out. And I basically knocked on Eden's door one day, and they were looking for somebody to run their lathe. They were going to train me to run, because people were taking acetates home at the time. So I got into mastering effectively, although low key.
Right, and
so that's how it started.
Okay, and was that an advantage in terms of thinking about frequencies and stuff like that?
Yeah.
Right, okay.
It taught me a lot. I mean, Mike Gardner, one of the founders of the studio, was a great inspiration for me and a great mentor. Him and Chris Glass, who was the technical wizard at Eden. I learned so much from them. They were trained by the BBC, so they had a very solid grounding, and this is how the proper procedure of a chain would work and stuff like that. Yeah, so then I progressed they allowed me to use the studio at night, and I'd bring friends in and sort of practice recording and stuff like that. So, and as I said, it was all 4-track. We had a 4-track Ampex, an AG 440, I think they were called. So I got into like bouncing to stereo and back again, and all that, the techniques that was prevalent in the day.
And so when is this what sort of year is this?
Oh my God, this is, must have been around 72, 73, something like that.
Right, okay.
Quite early. Very early. 73. Yeah, perhaps 74 at the most. No, probably 72, 73.
Right.
Because then we moved to, there was a compulsory purchase order put on the area that the studio was in. So they used the money from that and borrowed some to find a plot. It was an old factory in Chiswick. And then basically the studio was built from the ground up. And we had a porter cabin outside, and we built our own desk which was designed by Mike and Chris. All the electronics pretty much done by Chris, and we designed and built our own desk there. I learned all about winding coils for various frequency taps and things like that. So that was another great experience, doing all of that and wiring up the studio.
So how long was the mastering?
I probably went on with that for at least a year, I think.
Okay.
And in between that, because I was doing that during the day, and then I'm kind of being the office body as well, answering phone calls and booking in sessions and things in between. And then in some evenings, I'd be helping with sessions, sort of learning about mic placements and things like that, and helping. Mike used to do all the recordings then, and as I said, in the evenings, I'd try and do my own thing too. But yeah, probably about a year or so. Maybe gone for a little longer, but I think about a year, at least a year and a bit, something like that.
So enough to get an understanding that there was something much deeper within it to...
Oh, yeah.
Right, okay.
I mean, we used to get things from record labels. Like I cut God knows how many copies of Nights in White Satin for, I can't remember the label. Was it Pi or Decca, one of those labels? They wanted... I don't know, like 50 or 100 copies that were being sent out to, all for promotion and radio stations and things. And we got the gig. And so I just was cutting one after the other. I was so sick of that bloody song. Even before it was released, I was sick of it. So there was stuff like that, which was, that we did, which was quite bizarre. They were not just the sessions that we were cutting for.
And was that a common thing?
Oh yeah, it was really common in those days. It was very common. And most mastering studios would be doing stuff like that for labels. Either 12-inch or 7-inch samplers, 10-inch samplers sometimes, like EPs. So yeah, I got a real understanding of what you could and couldn't do with the lacquer. And I think that held me in good stead because I understood, obviously working in analog, knowing that it was going to go to vinyl, I understood what I could and couldn't do in the mix, how it had to sound overall to really cut through and make an impact. So I had that grounding, which I think helped me a lot in the way I listened to stuff, I think. And I used to attend all my mastering, so everything that I was involved with, even stuff I just engineered, I used to be sent off quite happily to monitor the mastering sessions. So I really enjoyed doing that. I got to know quite a few mastering engineers around London. It was great fun. I used to love doing that.
And of course, being able to communicate to them what you wanted or what you needed in a particular track and stuff in their language.
Absolutely. And learning more because, obviously the technology, it improved. The kinds of EQs that they used were better. They had, the way they talked about compression and limiting was more advanced probably than the stuff I was using at the time. So yeah, all of that was great. And I had a good rapport with them. I still really enjoy mastering. But of course, a lot of it now is, we get from digital files, so it's not quite the same, but things have to be looked at in a different way, obviously for CD and stuff. So, and obviously streaming now, they think about the sort of the sonic spectrum in a different way and how it's going to come across on ear pods and all the rest of it. So it's changed dramatically, which is what scares me about a lot of people saying, yeah, I'll do mastering. And do you actually understand what's going on here? That always made me nervous, but I guess, there could be some great mastering engineers who are just starting out and learning. So
yeah, well, they're learning a different thing, essentially, isn't it?
Yeah,
for now.
Absolutely. For now.
Yeah.
Right, so.
You're talking about the electronic side. How electronics are you?
I wouldn't say that I'm an electronics expert, but I have a basic understanding of stuff, the way things are made, I guess, the way EQs behave, the kind of curves that are set up and the way they interact with each other and all that kind of stuff. So I think I have a good grounding with that. I mean, a simple thing like compressors, what do you think most people think of a compressor? Oh, well, it squashes the sound, or I can make my drum sound really thwacky or whatever. But do they really understand what's going on with it? And I think, being grounded in those things and understanding how to use them in certain ways with, say, between a vocal and a snare drum or a vocal and over a string section just to keep, strange little squeaky peaks down, things like that. I think I had a really good grounding with not just understanding how to use them, but understanding how they were working and what they were doing gave you a better understanding of how you should actually use them in the real world. So I think, as far as electronics, though, designing stuff, I had one of my best friends who unfortunately died 2 years ago. We met on on an APRS course that was set up by Guildford University years ago, which I was sent off on to understand how microphones worked and how they were made.
So who sent you?
My studio, Eden Studios, they sent me. It was APRS had done this deal with the Tonmeister course, which is held at Guildford University. And I can't remember, it was like 2 weeks or something. I mean, it wasn't part of it was kind of part of the course, but a sort of segmented thing. Philip was working at Strawberry Studios in, where is it? Up north outside
Manchester or somewhere, isn't it?
Manchester, that's right, yeah. It wasn't Manchester, it was a subsidiary anyway. And we met there. We were the only two really who were working in studios at the time. There were a lot of other people there who were still just tape ops. They weren't really doing anything physical. We were both engineering to some degree. But Philip was a real whiz kid. I mean, he built stuff for my home studios, or he built some monitors and things, monitoring controls and things like that for me, which are fabulous. But I also learned odds and ends from him. It's like, hey, Phil, how can I do this? And he'd come up with some idea or a pedal, phase pedal out of the blue, things like that. I have a grasp, but I wouldn't call myself an electronics engineer by any stretch. Doing things like winding wires on a coil and knowing that if you tapped out at this point, that would be, you'd be centering at 2.8 kilohertz or something. You know what I mean? You start to kind of, something goes up in your brain. It makes a kind of sense. I wouldn't be able to design that from scratch, but I had all these notes and I'd follow them. And it was a 3-day week at that time in England where we had no electricity for the rest of the week. So it was only, so all the lights would go off. So we'd have lanterns and I'd be in this really cold porta cabin with tons of wires and stuff everywhere and a carcass of a desk behind me, winding stuff. And I'm sure some of them would, I'd miscount because the phone went off or something, So God knows, the desk was never that even. Say 2 kilohertz was never exactly 2 kilohertz across all the channels, but it was close enough and it sounded great. It was one of the best sounding desks I think I ever worked on. Amazing headroom, much more than a Neve even. It was just phenomenal, really phenomenal. People think that the Costello stuff, the drum sounds, that I was compressing his kit like mad, but I wasn't. There were no compressors involved. I was just cranking up the mic amps like crazy and sending it to tape. And tape we used to only run at +4. We didn't even overmod the tape recorders. It was all to do with the mic amps and the tape. Very little compression on the tape, but a lot more going on with the amps. And that was that incredible dynamic sound.
The guys who designed the desk. So was that ever a commercial product or anything like that, or? No,
it was Mike Gardner, one of the co-owners of Eden Studios, and Chris Glass, who was the partner really and electronics whiz kid. And both of whom were working at the BBC. And they were both cameramen, actually. They were senior cameramen at the Beeb. Chris used to be on the camera crew for Old Grey Whistle Test.
Wow.
That goes back, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But he was also friends with Pete Townsend and that whole crew. So he was involved with the guys that looked after the Who and made stuff and electronics. And Chris they were all very pally. They all met at art school. So there was a really interesting influence that came from him through them.
So that was kind of the norm at those times. Like people these days, nip off the tome and buy something to do something.
Yeah.
But in those days, it was a case of, should we need to build this? Because it doesn't exist and you can't go and buy it. Is that true?
We built everything. Yeah, absolutely. We built everything. We built, like our headphone amps in the studio. There were these boxes that we'd made and each one had a quad amp in it. and very, sockets to drive at least sort of 6 pairs of headphones, and a feed that came off one of the wall panels to drive the quad. But we just made it, and the panels were anodized. They were designed by Mike. He used to letraset all the panels. They were all anodized. We'd put them together with beautiful, screws and everything. They looked like somebody had bought, had them made in Germany or something, but they were all made by us. Everything like that, pedals to turn things on and off. Well, all our paneling on the desk was all letrasetted and anodized by companies. So it looked like a professional desk, but it was actually made by us. They found a fantastic carpenter because they couldn't figure out how to do the frame. The frame was all made in wood. And he made this beautiful frame. I mean, it was just fabulous, So and everything fitted precisely. I mean, they weren't doing anything, in any kind of lackadaisical way. It was all very precise and very perfect. And it sounded absolutely great, And as I said, if there was anything we needed, it would be made. Mike would go off and make something. We needed to switch. I remember at one point, Aldo and I was like, God, if only we could just switch between the tape. We had 2 stereo tape decks at the time. It ended up being 3. Just being able to be by them and switch between them rather than having to go back to the desk. So Mike made up a panel and his box, and it was, and the next day there it was. It was fantastic. So it was an amazing place on that level. I mean, people talk about Abbey Road and all that, but it was pretty much the same. Everyone was doing the same thing. Decca was that. I mean, Decca, one of the greatest studios of our time in this country. Probably in lots of ways better than Abbey Road. Abbey Road's great because it has so many fabulous old mics and tons of old gear.
Yeah.
But they're just rooms like anywhere else. In fact, I hated Studio 2. I thought it sounded dreadful. I don't know how the Beatles ever made anything in it. It was just, perhaps in those days when they were working, it was great. But when I went there, it was a horrible, horrible sound.
And when did you go there?
It was, I can't remember exactly when. We went there once with Costello. I think it was before we did, it might have been before we did the Get Happy album. And nobody liked it. The thing we hated most was the long staircase running up and down between the control room and the studio. And it's like, I can't deal with this. And the people there didn't understand. Anyway, we left. And I also went back. I think the Trash Can Sinatras really wanted to mix at Abbey Road. And so we booked in for a couple of days. And again, it was Studio 2. And none of us liked the way it sounded. We were all like, what happened to our tapes? Why does it sound so strange? And there was lots of umming and ahhing and accusing me of not lining up the tape recorder properly when it was just like, no, it's not happening. So we ended up at Eden in their brand spanking Studio 2 and mixed the album there. Yeah, so I never really worked there. I mean, we tried stuff out, but I never felt comfortable there. Perhaps it was the ghost of the Beatles or something like that. We just never really got it together.
Yeah.
But there were very few studios around London that I did like, actually. I preferred Rockfield is probably my favourite room in both of them in this country.
Right, okay. Yeah, because I remember you telling me before you you designed the acoustics in Eden, wasn't that correct? Or had an involvement anyway? We were all
I didn't have an involvement in the acoustics itself, but I learned a lot. The guy who designed the acoustics was an acoustician called Ken Shearer. He handed over the specifications to the architectural company whose name escapes me, but they had this Swiss designer who was a mathematical genius. Anyway, he designed these bizarre, because it was all based on resonant panels. So, they were resonant absorbers, I should say. So the walls were actually gigantic panels, and there were these weird shapes, obviously had to reflect in different directions as well. He came up with, it was like a jigsaw puzzle, the ceiling, the walls and everything. He did this fantastic design. So hanging out with, when Ken used to come to the studio and the architects, and they discuss, these frequencies, or having to put more sand on the roof because the roof's vibrating at a particular frequency or whatever, all that sort of stuff. I sort of gleaned quite a bit from them. That was a very interesting period. It was a very unique design and worked incredibly. It was one of the flattest rooms, certainly, I think I've ever worked in. Anything you did in that control room would sound fabulous outside, which is why we kept getting so much work. I think people were really impressed. The record label certainly were very impressed with it. It was great. We didn't have a hand in designing, but obviously the aesthetics, I think Mike and Philip Love, who was the other owner at the time, we were involved in choosing colors and things like that. But the architects' design team were just brilliant. The doors were incredible. We had everything was state of the art at the time.
I can't remember who I was chatting to, but they were saying that back in the day, lads would aim a particular thing at a studio. They might go to one studio for strings, one studio for drums, one studio for vocals or whatever. And is that why do you think that every studio had such a personality that was so different?
I think everyone was trying to create something that they felt was them. It was the way they wanted it to sound and feel, I think, was also very important. I mean, I did that. I used to love working at Advision for string overdubs. Eden was okay, but it didn't have an immensely high ceiling. So recording strings was, it would sound quite claustrophobic and very rock. If you wanted something more open, you had to go to a bigger room. And Advision was one that I used to use a few times, actually. I quite liked.
Advision was a sort of a TV studio, was it? Or
No, well, they did all kinds of things. They did a lot of rock albums, prog rock albums. Yes, famously used Advision for all their albums.
Oh, right, okay.
I think ELP, Zeppelin even used them, I think, a couple of times. But they also had a film. They had a film dubbing studio, very much like Abbey Road, huge soundstage as well. And I think they did a lot of work there for that. I think Abbey Road probably stole a lot of work from them, which is one of the reasons they started to lose money. They also had one of the first Quad 8 desks, I think the only Quad 8 desk in the country, which was quite phenomenal. Yes, used to use that room with that desk. I used it a couple of times to mix stuff, which was quite cool. But yeah, I mean, there was Olympic Studios was great for drums. You know, I forgot what number it was, but the bigger room downstairs was a great room for drum tracks. And if you wanted a big, fast sound, I mean, that's exactly what people did. They would go to different rooms for different reasons. There were producers that liked to be settled in one particular space because they felt that was going to work for this artist or whatever. So they'd be in, I don't know, wherever, Abbey Road or wherever. And that's where they'd work. I think nowadays that sort of disappeared. And also people are doing so much stuff at home. I mean, there's so many engineers and producers now that have their own setup at home, and, and they're doing great work, unless the money's there, but certainly for tracking. I mean, I did some stuff not so long ago, last year, I think, was it, with Ash Sohn, the drummer. I got him to do some drums on a track, and he's in Norfolk. So we did the stuff remotely, and it worked very well. I had a guitarist who did stuff for me from Boston and America. I mean, it's all become a bit sort of not disjointed, but it's the whole kind of concept of that is kind of being diluted, I think. I mean, for instance, if you were offered a band to produce tomorrow, where would you want to record it? Can you sit down and say, yeah, I'd really like to be in this room? I tell you where I'd like to be in this room is Grouse Lodge. I think is one of the best studios anywhere. They're just that big room is just phenomenally flat to work in. Great drum sound, a wonderful feeling there. I really, really love working there. But there's a few places that come to mind. I'd like Rockfield Studio 2, the Coach House, is fantastic for drum tracking and basic tracks. The other rooms are wonderful for everything else. If Eden Studios were still around, I'd probably do most of my work there in Studio 1. The character of rooms has vanished. Like Morgan Studios that I was attracted to when I was a young teenager, there were certain records that were coming out of that place that just, they had a noise about them that was, you couldn't describe. It's like, wow, it doesn't sound like anything else. There's it was a very dry sound. It must have been heavily, damp, the whole room. And then when sort of in the mid-70s, when that whole kind of East Lake, West Lake thing started happening, you got very dead sounds coming from America, which I also really loved. I love the kind of closeness that real close miking brought you in a very dead room. Because now I much prefer to, have a much more open sound and record drums, perhaps with just the two mics or whatever. But they had these noises about them. Everything sounded kind of, had a different, I don't know how to describe it. They just had a complete character to them. And it was always down to where they were working. I worked at a studio called Snake Ranch up in California, up in the hills. And I think the Kinks might have owned it at one point, but it was the whole place. Everything was wood. The building was wood. The studio was lined in wood. Everything was wood, and it had this wonderful kind of warm character to it. It's difficult to describe, but it worked really well. Then you go to another place. You go to Cherokee or something in Hollywood, and it was much more kind of pizzazzy. The big room was very much like any big room you'd walk into in London. Except that, people also had different desks. They used to use an old Trident A series, which they'd remodeled. People would have...
Who did, sorry?
This was Cherokee. They had these Trident A series desks, which had a real character to them. Rockfield used to have a TSM at one point, Trident, which I think was one of the best desks, unsung heroes, one of the best desks made. People would have a Neve. People would have APIs. All of those things made a difference as well. The kind of tape recorders you used made a difference.
And the tape you use.
Yeah, and the tape you use. I mean, Pete Townsend was a big fan of 3M machines, and which I think were fabulous machines, but very temperamental. They sounded very different to the Ampexes. I really liked the MM1100s and 1200s, and they had a very different character. Studios were very different as well. They were, very clean. So all of those things made such different. People talk about that analog sound, but what are they really talking about? There's a whole mishmash of things that were involved. Yes, digital, does do strange things to the sound. It's not quite the same, but I don't believe that whole analog digital thing anymore. I've come away from it, and I could never imagine going back to working on tape again. It's just so cumbersome and limiting. And getting used to being able to edit quickly, like, I'll just take these two things and join them up in that much time.
Yeah.
You know,
Or trying stuff.
or trying stuff. Yeah, I mean, endlessly trying stuff. Oh God, I'm running out of tape. Quick, guys, stop! It's all of that. So, you know, and hundreds of pounds a reel. It's just crazy. I mean, it's a great fun thing to do. I think to actually. It's a vanity thing now, I think. I don't think it has anything to do with the real world anymore. And it ends up at 44.1 anyway. You know,
yeah, indeed. Or an MP3.
Or an MP3, which is even worse. So, yeah. So, you know, I remember years ago, I'd been on a session all night. There was a TV session going on. There was some big band thing, and it was for independent TV studio, and they had their own engineers they bring in. And they'd done these takes with this band. It was like a big band thing. But they wanted to cut between one take and another. And I was outside having a cigarette and a coffee, trying to stay awake. Chris Glass actually came and said, Roger, they want to do an edit. Can you do it for them? The engineer's really scared. I said, what do you mean he's really scared? They don't do cuts on 2-inch. So I was like, yeah, okay. So I wandered in and very nonchalantly did the cuts for him and joined it up and walked out, and it was done. And they were very happy. I would be absolutely terrified to do that now. I just, you know, that was something like second nature at the time. That's what we did all the time. You know, you'd cut between takes and all the rest.
Yeah. I guess the fact that there was no other option.
No, not at all. That's how you worked. I mean...
But that's sort of thinking, you know, you're not thinking about a place where you can edit in a different fashion because there's no other way of doing it. You just do it.
That's exactly right. And, you know, I mean, I was taught how to cut tape and join it up on with a block on 1/4 inch. And then I learned how to do that on 1 inch. Then I learned how to do that on 2 inch. And it as I said, it becomes second nature. It's not something difficult. I mean, I used to mix, there were some things I used to mix where I'd mix, like verses. If it was quite complex mix, I'd do all the verses, then I'd do all the choruses. And then I'd chop
stick them together afterwards.
Which is a horribly laborious thing to do and quite dangerous and risky, but it does work. I didn't do it very often, but I've done that a few times. And, you know, recording at higher resolution and stuff is, you know, stuff doesn't sound bad at all. It sounds very good. I think a lot of it comes down to people not using EQ in the right way. I think that's what it is, you know. Some of the plugins that are being foisted on, you know, you've got to have this to get this sound. It's like, my God, 5,000 controls and graphics, and young people out there who are starting out or trying to do something, being convinced that they need to have this particular thing to make it sound like so-and-so or make it sound great. Have a hit. And it's all rubbish. It's all nonsense. Yeah. You don't need any of that. You just need your ears, and you need some good people in front of the mic.
So that's Roger's way to do it. Keep an eye out for a part 2 soon. Please go to geniusmove.ie to find out about my courses. Thanks for listening.